So we're presenting from Hilo this time. Thanks everybody for joining us. Yes, it sounds like Hilo folks are happy to have an in-person presenter. So today we're talking about invasives and weed management. We've got here today Chuck Chimera. Chuck is the weed risk assessment specialist for Hawaii Invasive Species Council. And Chuck's a great guy. He's going to give us a good talk. So everybody, please give him your attention. And let's see, any housekeeping. So Chuck, we normally take an hour, take a break.
Okay. Good morning. Do we have any sound?
If you want to take a break earlier or later, let me know now, and we can do that.
Well, somebody's got to let me know.
Okay.
Should take a break because once I get going, it's
we'll let you know. Don't worry. We'll just put our hands up and say right away, hey, Chuck.
Get up,
pull
me up, cut the power.
If you don't, these guys are gonna riot. So, let me switch the screen over for you. Can everyone see the screen okay? Is it presenter view or is it the full PowerPoint?
We see the PowerPoint.
Awesome. All right, Chuck, take it away.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I am one shot into my 2-dose COVID vaccination, and I got my second shot this Saturday. So if everybody's comfortable with me taking off my mask, just so I mumble generally, so maybe this will like minimize that a little bit. So I'm gonna take my mask off and say good morning. Nice to see everybody in person. I drove in from Honoka'a up the coast of the Big Island, and it's nice to actually get out and interact with some real people for a change. Not to take anything from you folks online, but it is nice to be in an actual room with real people. And I'm going to be talking about weed management in Hawaii. Russell asked me to come in and speak on that. And let's see, what do I need to do to advance?
Let me help you out there. Yeah.
Okay, so weed management for the next 2 hours, I'm going to be talking about how to start up, manage, and market a successful weed operation in the state. I'm not an expert on this, so I'm going to have to, learn a lot. Oh, wait a minute, I'm getting the, sorry. Okay, that was my lame attempt at an April Fool's Day joke. So happy April 1st. That's the last joke I'm going to make for the talk. So everything's going to be really serious from here on out. It's all going to be on the test, so pay attention. Okay. Weed management. So the goals for this class this morning are going to be to understand weeds and how to manage them. Very basic, straightforward. I broke the talk up into these sort of broad categories, starting out with the most basic, what is a weed? Then we'll get into some weed biology and ecology, how you manage weeds, whether you're a homeowner, gardener, or you work for agriculture, or maybe in conservation up in the mountains in the forest. And I'll wrap things up with some useful resources that you can help, or that will help you hopefully pursue some knowledge on your own, because this is a big topic, a lot of material to cover, and there's no way it can all be addressed in just 2 hours. So to begin with, what is a weed? You may have heard people use this definition. This is like kind of the standard answer some people get. A weed is just a plant out of place. It's something growing where it is not wanted. I'm going to return to this definition a little bit later, but I'm going to go a little bit further back in time, maybe to the time when the Hawaiian Islands were forming, and talk about what's the difference between the types of plants that naturally occurred here versus the ones that were introduced and arrived later. And because we're all living in Hawaii, we know that we are surrounded by a vast ocean. We're smack dab in the center of the Pacific. We're a volcanic island chain that formed possibly as far away from any other large landmass, continental landmass on the planet. So we're incredibly isolated, and these islands that formed in the middle of the Pacific through volcanic action, you know, when they originally emerged from the ocean, they were barren lava with nothing growing on them, nothing living here. But when the first people arrived, the first Polynesian settlers that became the Hawaiian culture, when they arrived, they found a green, lush tropical landscape with plants, birds, all kinds of life living here. So that raises the question, how did things get here? So you may hear me during the course of the talk refer to things as native, non-native, invasive, or alien. These aren't meant to be any like negative connotations. They're just talking about how life arrived and evolved in Hawaii. So a native species is something that arrived in Hawaii through non-human means, and that so got here without any human help, or got here and then changed over time and evolved into a species that is unique in Hawaii. And this is just a sample of some of the very colorful and unique native plant and animal life that is considered native to Hawaii. It got here on its own, evolved with over time, and is most of it is found nowhere else on Earth. And when you talk about things arriving in Hawaii and getting here, crossing that vast ocean distance without human help, people wonder, well, how is that possible? And you know, very simply, they've broken it down into these three broad categories. If you, hopefully, this is a refresher for most of you. But if you're hearing this for the first time, we refer to this as the 3 W's: wind, wings, and waves. Before people got here and could bring things with them, life had to cross that vast ocean distance, either by floating on a wind current, like a seed or a spore, flying under its own power, possibly with wind assistance, or drifting on an ocean current. And biologists and ecologists who study the diversity of life on islands were interested in how things naturally arrived there. And there was this one ecologist talking about island biology, saying that if you were to set up a colony on an island using the wind, wings, and waves method with people, it would be as if only champion swimmers, yachtists, and balloonists would get here. So it would make for a unique subset of the potential pool of things that could arrive. And as a result, wind, wings, and waves, things that cross that big ocean barrier, were a unique subset of all the life that occurred on Earth. And once they arrived here and had hundreds of thousands or millions of years to change and evolve, they became so unique that they were found nowhere else on Earth. So a subset of a native species, one that arrived here without human help, is called an endemic species. It's found nowhere else in the world. And one of the things about Hawaii that makes it so special from a plant perspective is that almost 90% of our native plants are endemic, meaning they are found nowhere else on the planet. So we might not be as biodiverse or contain the same number of species as other tropical areas like, you know, the rainforests of South America or Indonesia, but we have what is believed to be right now the highest rate of endemism or uniqueness for our plants anywhere else on the planet. And these are just two examples. One of our native silver swords found on the Big Island, and the alula, or cabbage on a stick, found on one species on the island of Kauai and the other on the island of Molokai. So Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, highest rate of endemism for plants in the world. We also have indigenous species. Those are native species that got to Hawaii on their own without any human assistance, but they're also found in other places in the world, naturally occurring. So things like our beach naupaka, Naupaka kahakai, our lima plant, a popular lei-making plant in the hibiscus family. and even a carnivorous plant in the bogs of Kauai, a native sundew. These are all native species that got to Hawaii on their own, but are also found in other parts of the world. You'll find the naupaka plant growing throughout the Pacific. It's got very buoyant fruit that float on ocean currents, allow it to spread all over the Pacific and establish on coastal shores. So native is endemic and indigenous. And then, again, this isn't meant to be an, oh, did you have a question?
Did you say endemic and indigenous?
Endemic and indigenous are both other ways of saying a native species. So,
Okay.
and then alien, this isn't meant to be a negative connotation. This is just referring to how something arrived in a place. And in Hawaii, plants that are considered aliens are ones that arrived with human assistance, either intentionally, they were brought here, or accidentally. Maybe they hitchhiked on something like your shoe or a potted plant. The first alien or non-native species that got to Hawaii arriving with human assistance were plants and animals that arrived with the first human colonists here. They're called Polynesian Introductions. Sometimes the plants are referred to as canoe plants because they arrived in these voyaging canoes that Polynesians traveled across the Pacific in. And there are only about 34 non-native alien species that were brought with the first humans. And the majority of them, you could even maybe argue all of them, were brought intentionally. The plants definitely were all brought intentionally. They were all important food, fiber plants, you know, for fabric or for shelter. So our kalo or taro, kukui trees, bananas arrived with the first people. These are all considered non-native species, but they were all had some value to them. There were also some animals like the Polynesian rat or the kiore, pigs, geckos that also came with the first humans. Then, during the age of European exploration around the globe, the first Europeans to arrive in Hawaii, you know, arrived on the Big Island in, you know, on the other side, near Kona, just south of Kona. And once Hawaii was put on the map for European travelers, explorers, they realized that Hawaii was really nicely situated in the middle of the Pacific for those transoceanic voyages. And so once Hawaii started to be regularly visited and settled by Europeans and other cultures from around the world, they started bringing plants and animals with them as well. So the rate of introductions increased. Again, lots of useful plants that were for food, ornamental, crops, timber, animals for food, many of which then escaped and became quite destructive, and some unintentional introductions like the mosquito. I believe we have now 8 species of mosquito in the Hawaiian Islands. None of them are native here. So pre-European discovery of the Hawaiian Islands, there were no mosquitoes here. All kinds of problems, diseases that mosquitoes can carry with not only people, but with our native birds, all started about just a little under 200 years ago in Lahaina on Maui, where the first mosquitoes were accidentally introduced. So the rate of introduction increases. So now we have about 500 or so non-native or alien species that were brought. And then now fast forward to modern times where literally with the click of a button on your computer, you can almost get something arriving here overnight, depending on the air traffic. So the rate of introductions, non-native species has just dramatically increased in the modern era. We have at least 8,000 to 10,000 non-native plant species, probably more like 13,000 now. We have new marine and brackish water species. We had no native land reptiles. The number is now 40 at least, as well as amphibians. There were no native frogs in the Hawaiian Islands. Now there's at least 6 that are established, and there are new insect species arriving almost every day. So again, we went from the era where things arrived by wind, wings, and waves to the modern era where things can literally arrive overnight. And just as an example, all of this is going to be on the test. I'll give you a couple of minutes to write this down. Now, this is a table taken from a Hawaiian natural history book, and it looks at the rate that things would have arrived naturally through wind, wings, and waves, and how much time it would have taken for them to evolve into the species that became the native species in Hawaii. And based on the number of founders that arrived and the amount of time that has passed, they made some estimates that the first, to account for the number of, say, like flowering plants that occur in Hawaii, one new colonization would have occurred every 105,000 years. So we went from a species arriving once, and just in terms of plants, every 105,000 years to, a seed basically being able to ship overnight and get here in less than 24 hours. So we've completely changed the rate of introduction in Hawaii. And that's why we have so many species that didn't occur here naturally. So, we live in the modern era. There's really no way to slow down that rate of introduction, despite the best efforts of some people to slow that pace down. That Pandora's box has been open, and new species are going to continue to arrive very, very rapidly. So are all aliens bad? Just because something got here with humans, it was brought here accidentally or intentionally, does that make it bad? Like, obviously not. Obviously not. We would not be able to survive where we live without the non-native plants and, in some cases, animals that rely on for food and for building materials, etc. So non-native species, alien species make our landscapes more beautiful. They provide us with food. They provide us with nourishment, building materials, etc. So yeah, we couldn't survive on the planet without these non-native species. But we are concerned about the ones that have become invasive. Invasive is a term that refers to something, a plant or an animal that doesn't stay put, spreads quickly and easily, and can take over and cause some kind of a problem. So invasive is a subset of an alien or a non-native species. And here's just a little menagerie of some of our least favorite invasive or non-native species in the Hawaiian Islands. Some, like the brown tree snake, that haven't really established here yet, and we want to keep out. I'm just going to go through some of these rapidly. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but if you live in a place where little fire ants are established, you know how bad invasive species can make your life, how miserable they can. If you're a farmer, if you're a fruit grower, you're trying to pick fruit and you have these stinging ants raining down on you, just makes life miserable. It adds costs to your business, adds costs to taking care of your property. The little fire ant, well established on the Big Island. There are populations on Maui, on Kauai, on Oahu that are actively being managed and controlled, and hopefully in those cases eliminated. But on this island, especially in the Hilo and the Puna area, it's basically, unfortunately, just something you have to deal with now, and you have to learn to manage it as best you can. The coffee berry borer is another terrible invasive species that impacts agriculture, one of our most important economic crops in the state. Bores into the seeds of the coffee bean, the part that we harvest to sell around the state and around the world. So that's just another one that wasn't here. I think it's been here for maybe about 10 years or less. The coconut rhinoceros beetle. This would be devastating to not only our native palms, but all of the landscaping, ornamental palms, coconut palms that people think of when they travel to Hawaii. That's like our iconic palms waving in the wind. This non-native beetle is on the island of Oahu, and they're trying to keep it off of all the other islands because of the damage it could cause to our native and ornamental palms. The fortunate thing about this one is that it's got these very gigantic beetles that are not strong flyers. So it's unlikely that it will fly from one island to another, unless it books a seat on Hawaiian Airlines. But if you're moving plant material inter-island, you could potentially be transporting, the eggs or the larvae of this thing. That's why, areas where it's found, they're trying to be very careful and quarantine those sites to keep them from being spread. And if you've been driving around the state and you see these things that look like a kind of a funny looking bird feeder, like a black box, I should have put a picture of them up. These are pheromone traps used to attract these beetles. So they're kind of like the early warning system to see if the beetles are in the area. So far, only on the island of Oahu in a limited area. Rapid ohia death. This is a terrible fungal disease that is killing our ohia forests, devastating ohia trees on Hawaii Island. It's unfortunately the worst. There's two different species of this fungus that kill ohia. One, the luku ohia, or the destroyer, kills ohia trees very rapidly. The other one is a little more slow. Over 100,000 acres on this island are infested. And it's also become, both species have become established on the island of Kauai. There have been a few detections on, or I should say one detection on Maui. The one tree infected was a planted tree, quickly eliminated. I believe there have been 1 or 2 cases of the Julio ohia on Oahu. I'm not 100% sure about that. But this is one we don't want to get into any of our other ohia forests if we can keep it out. Unfortunately, it's a fungus transported by spores that can be carried on sawdust, drifting on the wind, beetle droppings or frass. So it's really hard to keep this contained. Another one that really impacts this agriculture is the rat lungworm. This is the thing of nightmares. This non-native nematode that normally is found in rats gets spread through rat droppings that then slugs, or some cases crustaceans like crabs or shrimp, or even frogs or amphibians can ingest the droppings of this of the rat. And then if we accidentally or intentionally eat something with the nematode in it, we can get the parasite, and then it could cause terrible health problems. So anybody who grows vegetables and has a garden should be concerned about this. And that's why we have to wash everything we pick from our garden and make sure that there are no slugs on it. Do not want to eat a slug. Don't. You can look into this more, but don't do it before you go to bed, because it will give you nightmares. And then I just threw this in there. This isn't something we have in Hawaii, but last year when it didn't seem like the world could become any more nightmarish or terrible, 2020, we all want to forget it. There were these stories about this giant Asian hornet, sometimes called the murder hornet, detected in the Pacific Northwest in the state of Washington. And they call it the murder hornet because sometimes the sting can cause human death. But the real concern with this is that they raid beehives and can completely wipe out a honeybee colony. They're like these armored battle tanks. The bees try to defend them, defend the hive, and they cannot hold this thing off. It just goes in and essentially decapitates all the bees. So you find like bee bodies lying outside of a hive, and this thing goes in there to raid the larvae for its own young. So this is something that is not in Hawaii, and we never want it here, but there is a pathway that it could arrive here. Christmas tree shipments. That is one possible way we could, if it became established in the Pacific Northwest, it could potentially get to Hawaii. So this is why we have to be really careful about what we bring into the state. This is native to Asia, so it is not established widespread on the mainland US yet. that we know, but they're still trying to figure it out. They're trying to track these things down and hopefully get rid of them before they become established. Throwing around a lot of terms. Invasive, from my standpoint, invasive has to include these three categories. So it's got to be imported from abroad. It's got to be able to spread on its own, because if it just sits there and grows where you plant it or stays put, what's the problem? And then the third thing is it has to be unwanted. So it's got to cause some kind of problems that somebody regards as an issue. So whether it be economic, ecological, causing a problem to human health. And that's where we're going to talk about weeds today. This last term is subjective, right? One person's weed could be another person's like valued ornamental plant or crop or, you know, sentimental plant that they're growing for a reason. So just because something is called a weed and is unwanted doesn't mean it's bad for everybody. To demonstrate that, I used to work in conservation on Maui, and we were doing dry forest restoration. And part of the process of restoring a native dry forest was getting rid of the smothering layer of kikuyu grass that just carpeted the ground, didn't allow any native forest plants to regerminate or grow. It was just like putting a blanket on the ground that nothing could come up through. And over on the right, you'll see pictures of like a dying dry forest where just the old trees, the trunks of dead trees sticking up through the kikuyu grass. And over on the left, where they started doing restoration, you're getting a forest regenerating. All kinds of plants are able to grow now because you got rid of that smothering kikuyu grass blanket. So highly invasive grass in dry forest ecosystems. But if you're a rancher, you love it because it is a very valued forage. Pasture grass is intentionally brought here to feed cattle, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where cattle graze it, it's not a problem at all. And it also makes a very nice lawn if it's mowed and can be maintained. After a hard day of killing kikuyu grass in the dry forest, I could drive home, take my boots off and walk on the kikuyu grass in my lawn and just feel fine about it there because it's not causing any problems in a landscape setting. So one plant can be very valuable in one situation and completely terrible in another. In the past, you know, before we started to become more conscious about, you know, native species and conservation, there were a lot of native plants or a subset of native plants that were considered weeds. So this is a case where, you know, a plant that is out of place, a plant that is unwanted. This book that was first published in 1966, Handbook of Hawaiian Weeds, includes several species of Hawaiian native plants that were called weeds. Some of them, like on the upper left-hand corner there, that's our native poppy, the puakala. In the lower left, it's pukiave. It's a native, it looks a little bit like a little miniature Christmas tree with the fruit, like ornaments on it. Those both persist in pastures. So I think what happened was, like, you know, ranchers would see that these things would be growing in their pasture. The cattle wouldn't like to eat them, so they called them a weed. They were just persisting. They weren't really spreading or taking over. One of our native morning glories that occurs on the coast, Pa'uohi'iaka, some cultural relevance, some nice stories behind that plant. That's another one that's called a weed. And in the lower right corner, we have two native parasitic vines. So they don't photosynthesize or produce their own food. They do grow on other plants and they parasitize them. They take out nutrients from the plant. The one in the lower right is called kaunaoa. It's used in lei making, but people saw that and said, oh, it's got to be terrible, it's got to be bad. We'll categorize it as a weed. And then I just have to share this picture because I came across this in my work and I just thought this is just so, how times have changed. This is a publication from 1966. It's herbicides for site preparation. It's basically an experiment to see what kind of herbicides you can use to kill native understory plants so that you can plant some kind of plantation tree. And I pulled out this quote: to replace the slow-growing, poor-quality native forests with fast-growing exotic hardwoods of high quality. And, you know, they had this machine that looks like something out of a Dr. Seuss book with this big fogger spraying herbicide into the understory, you know, getting rid of these undesirable native, you know, I guess you would call them weeds in this case. So again, the term weed is subjective, but when I talk about something invasive, it can't just be unwanted. It's also got to cause some kind of problem by spreading. It's also got to be from somewhere else. So I wouldn't consider our natives weeds. In most cases, they are not spreading. They're just holding their own, if not rapidly declining. So an invasive species actually has a federally recognized term or a federally recognized definition in the federal government. It's an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. That was an executive order signed by President Clinton in the late 90s. And it was to recognize that invasive species are a problem, not just to the natural environment, but to our economy and to our human health. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea about like why something is called a weed, what weeds are. Now I'm going to go into weed biology and ecology, starting with impacts. And again, if you have a garden or a yard or landscape, you know, everybody knows what a weed is. It's a plant that you don't want growing where it's growing. So weeds aren't just necessarily unsightly. If you're like, you know, want to keep a really nice, neatly maintained landscape, they do compete for water, nutrients, light, and space. So they can actually cause problems in your yard, garden, or landscape. And that's why we try to control them. In some cases, they can be aesthetically unpleasing. They can even reduce property values. I'm originally from New York State, and when I go visit my parents back home, they complain about their neighbor's yard who has allowed all the wildflowers and things to grow in his lawn rather than keeping that nice maintained lawn. And my parents would say, you know, it's really making the property in the area, the values, we're worried the property values are going to go down. And I tell them, Mom, those are all plants that are good for pollinators. They're like much more biodiverse. You know, they support wildlife. And so I try to give them like my ecological spiel, and they don't want to hear it, you know, because in their eyes, it's just this like weedy patch. It's aesthetically unpleasing. So you can understand why, you know, in some cases you want to keep your weeds under control. Weeds also impact agriculture, forestry, cause economic losses, added costs. This is a picture from Ulupalakua on the island of Maui, where fireweed has invaded a pasture. So, you know, if you're just looking at from the purely aesthetic standpoint, you might say, oh, how beautiful, field of golden flowers. It's spectacular. But if you're a rancher or you have horses and you're trying to use that, this is terrible because it can poison your horses. It can cause your cattle to become sick. And it's actually the sign of an unhealthy pasture. So that's just one of, you know, hundreds of thousands of weeds that can cause problems in agriculture or forestry. Weeds also impact the natural environment. Half of my career has been spent doing conservation work with the National Park Service and the USGS. And we were always doing work in native forest conservation and restoration. So anybody who's done that kind of work knows that there are all kinds of invasive species that invade our native ecosystems. They can reduce biodiversity, they can affect the watershed function, and they can basically turn a healthy, thriving, diverse forest into a monoculture of you know, just one or a few non-native species. This is Hidicium gardnerianum, sometimes referred to as Kahili ginger, but that makes people think it's from Hawaii. It's actually from the Himalayas. So we now refer it to Himalayan ginger if we're in a good mood, or if we're in a bad mood, we call it toilet brush ginger. It's really beautiful until you see what it can do to a native forest. Completely take over the understory, prevent any other seedlings from germinating or growing, and All you have here is, the adult trees forming the canopy. So from the air, you might think, okay, that's a nice, healthy forest. But you get into the understory, it's like somebody planted a cornfield there. And over time, as the adult trees die, there will be no young seedlings or saplings to take their place. And that forest is functionally dead. So weeds cause all kinds of environmental problems. On this island, and on all the islands, non-native grasses particularly can increase fire hazard, which is a hazard to humans, to our property, as well as to some of our rare native dryland ecosystems. Hawaii's ecosystems were adapted to not have frequent fires, even though we have volcanic activity that causes fires on this island. Fire wasn't a natural part of the ecology here, but all these non-native grasses that were brought in changed that. So now you get plants that are adapted to fire. They burn very hot, very fast, and then they can come back very quickly and recover from fire. This is fountain grass. It's an African grass that was introduced as an ornamental. It's got these feathery plumes that, can look quite attractive, but they can just completely take over a lava flow and carry fire into places where we don't want it. So it's a big hazard on this island. And it is established a little bit on, I think, island of Oahu, and the Maui people are trying to keep it under control over there. But on this island, it's basically completely out of control on the Kona side. Plants can also wage chemical warfare against each other. Fancy term for that is called allelopathy. Some species can actually release chemicals through their roots or sometimes leached out of their leaves that can prevent other plants from germinating or growing around them. And strawberry guava is an example of one plant that is capable of that. Ironwood trees are another one. If you go into a dense ironwood stand or a strawberry guava stand, you'll see very little growing underneath them. That's part of it is based on light and nutrient use, so there's some competition, but part of it is also allelopathy. And then plants can impact the health of humans and our animals, be they pets or livestock. They have spines, thorns, burrs, sometimes chemicals or allergens, allergenic pollen. This vine on the woody liana on the left, cat's claw, is almost like living barbed wire. On the right, Castor Bean is a weedy plant you might see growing on the side of the road in some places. It contains the chemical ricin, which I believe is regarded as the most toxic natural plant poison in the world. And I think it was ricin was the chemical that some Russian spies used to kill a defector in England when they stuck him with an umbrella tipped with ricin. And so, it's like out of like a James Bond movie. So just because something has spines, thorns, or burrs, or is toxic doesn't mean it's going to be weedy or invasive. But if it is weedy and invasive and has one of these traits, it's bad news. And then, weedy plants or non-native plants can also be a host to pathogens. This is a picture of what used to be a dense stand of rose apple that's completely coated with this fungal rust it's now called Astropoccinia cidii, or some people called it ohia rust because it was growing on ohia as well, but it really did a number on rose apple. It was also found on some other native and non-native species. So when a non-native plant can host a pest or pathogen, it can cause problems to more desirable plants. And people have actually been controlling weedy coffee in some places because the coffee itself, the weedy coffee, the non-cultivated coffee, can host the coffee berry borer, and now there's a new coffee rust that has been detected in the state. So sometimes even the plant you're growing can be affected by wild versions of the plant because they host pests and pathogens. So those are just kind of an overview of some of the impacts caused by weeds. So now we're going to go and how do you classify weeds? How do you categorize them? How do you describe them? Because this is like where, you can't deal with something until you know what it is. You want to identify the thing and then come up with the solutions based on what you find out. So some broad ways that weeds and just plants in general are classified based on their taxonomy, their life cycle, their morphology or their shape, their physiology, the types of habitat they grow in. And then the last two, regulatory and non-regulatory, are more like human assigned, well, these are all human assigned constructs, but the last two have to deal with more policy. So to go over these briefly, taxonomy is the way that life is classified on Earth. So we've assigned these labels to plants and animals, and in the past, things were classified based on their similarities and differences. So the more similar two plant species looked, the more closely they were classified in taxonomic ranking. Nowadays, genetics and DNA are doing a lot of the classifying. So things that we used to think were closely related are turning out to be not so closely related. And things that look completely different, we're finding are more closely related than we ever thought. But that's a lesson for another day. I just wanted to point this out in case you come across this, or if you remember this from a high school or a college biology class. Life is classified under these broad categories: kingdom, division, or for animals, it's phylum. So kingdom, division, class, order, family, genus, and species. So those go from the broadest category to the most precise category. Kingdom is the broadest classification category on that we use. And I think right now there are 5 kingdoms recognized: plants, animals, fungi, bacteria is its own kingdom. And then there's another kingdom that called archaebacteria, very primitive life form. So there's 5 broad categories. We're talking about plants, so we're talking about the plant kingdom. And as you go down that ranking system, the plants in those categories become more closely related, more and more similar. And for the purposes of master gardeners and botany in general, we usually just focus on the family, genus, and species. And the scientific name is the genus and the species put together. You'll sometimes hear this called binomial nomenclature, binomial, 2 names. So the genus and the species name is the most reliable way to identify a plant. Because no matter where you go on Earth, what country you're in, what science class you're taking, the genus, species, the scientific name should generally be standard wherever you are. So that's the best name to get if you can figure it out. Common names can be confusing. If you use a common name, one place's common name can change if you go to a new location. And then common names can also be misleading from the standpoint of, just not truly representing what a plant is. I just picked out a bunch of plants that are occur in Hawaii, all include grass in the common name. So the first one, McCoy grass, is actually a sedge. So sedges are different than grasses. The second one, pepper grass, is in the mustard family. The Lysomakia nummularia is a flowering plant, so it's not even, it's very distantly related to grasses. Mimosa pudica, sensitive plant or sleeping grass. If you ever find one of those plants where the leaves close up suddenly, we call that sensitive grass. It's a legume. It's not really closely related to a grass at all. And then there's a lily with the grass in the name. Mondo grass, popular landscaping plant, actually a lily as well. So only plants in the family Poaceae, or used to be called Gramineae, are true grasses. So the scientific name will give you more information in most cases than the common name. So again, I say for our purposes, we usually focus on the family, the genus, and the species. Those are the categories that are most meaningful to most people that work with plants. The family is the broader category. That's the larger grouping of plants. In the case of this hairy spurge, that's the common name. It's in the family Euphorbiaceae, or the Euphorbia family, the spurge family. The kukui tree, our state tree, is in this family, as are some important crops like manioc, or the plant used to make cassava or tapioca, one of the staple food crops of the world. A lot of weeds in this family as well. A lot of times you'll break the leaves or the stems of these and they have a milky latex. That's one of the identifying features of this family. So the genus Euphorbia, that's the broader grouping. So there's many species of Euphorbia, including poinsettias, are in the Euphorbia genus. So another important economic plant. The species, though, there's only one species, Euphorbia Herta, with that name, and that's the, you probably encountered this on side of a road or in kind of a disturbed bare ground area. It thrives in disturbed places where a lot of other plants don't like to grow, and that's another sign of a weedy plant. Plants that can handle pretty harsh conditions. So again, you have the scientific name. That is the best, most precise way you can identify a plant. How many weeds are there? Well, there are estimates that the number of flowering plant species in the world, this is we're discovering new ones all the time, but there's an estimate that there are approximately 350,000 plant species found around the world. I did a quick and dirty overview of the number of non-native species that have been brought into Hawaii a few years ago. So these numbers are probably off by now, but I estimated at the time that there were about 12 to 13,000 introduced species in Hawaii, plant species. And the Bishop Museum in 2019 looked at plants that were naturalized or established, meaning they're self-perpetuating, they're spreading on their own without human assistance. And as of 2019, about 13% of these non-native species are naturalized, but only a small subset of those cause really serious problems. So, not every non-native species, again, is a weed or a problem, but some of them are. Ecologists have looked at this with plants and with other organisms, and they've come up with this very broad and dirty thing they call the TENS rule, which is basically, it's like an inverted pyramid where they look at all the plants or all the animals that are brought in from a place and introduced into a new location. Only a subset of those will become established, meaning that they'll start to spread. And of those, only a very small percentage will become a problem. And that's, I think they first did this with birds introduced into the United Kingdom, and they found that about 10% of all the birds brought there actually took or established, but only about 10% of that 10% became a problem. And these numbers, these percentages might vary depending on the organism, but the main point is just to say that not everything causes a problem. It's only a very small subset. This is just a quick and dirty overview of some important families of weeds. Again, that's the broader category of plants I mentioned. The family, there are a lot of weedy grasses, like crabgrass, weeds of your yard and garden, but also environmental weeds like fountain grass. Sedges can also be quite weedy. Purple nutsedge is a very tenacious weed of lawns and landscapes in Hawaii. Members of the sunflower or the daisy family, lots of important ornamental and economic crops, but also lots of weedy plants in that family as well. You'll find all kinds of weedy Asteraceae all over the place. Amaranths is another weedy family. Legumes, hugely important economic family, crops, forestry, native legume species. Also, lots and lots of weeds in this family as well. Weeds of your lawn, weeds of the forest. The Euphorbia family, I already mentioned. The mallow family, that's our hibiscus family. Our state flower is a native hibiscus. But there's lots and lots of weedy malvaceae or members of this family that particularly like to grow in yards, gardens, in croplands. They thrive in these disturbed habitats. I threw the rose family in there. You know, the rose is a popular ornamental family. It's an important fruit family. And some of these weedy plants are also food plants, like blackberries and thimbleberries, but they can become very weedy and invasive, you know, and because they're covered in spines or thorns, they can also cause problems for humans and animals. And then the Mellostome family, I just threw that on there because we don't have any native mellostomes in Hawaii. The Melstomatesia is a tropical family. Got some very attractive, showy members of this family, but it's also got tons of weedy members, including some of our worst natural area invaders in Hawaii: Myconia, Castor's curse, or Clydemia, Tibouchina, all occur in this family. So from a conservation standpoint, mellostomes are not a good thing.
Is this a good time to take a short break?
Sure, yeah, we can take a break right now. How much time?
We usually give about 10 minutes.
Okay, so we can pause here and pick up at about, what time do you have?
9:53, so.
A little bit after 10, 10:03?
Sound good?
Sound good? Sound good, everybody? All right, I don't know if I have to do anything here, or just
I'll just pause.
keep it rolling. Is there a water fountain anywhere, or a?
If you have a bottle, there's a sink right in here.
Oh, okay, I did not.
Oh, there are others.
Oh, it's okay. I just noticed my my throat getting a little bit.
Oh, you're such a great. Oh, let me just mute this. You are back live.
Okay, we are now returning to our regularly scheduled programming. Commercial breaks are over. Hopefully everybody's back online wherever you are. I'll give another 10, 15 seconds, and then I'll get rolling again. Okay, returning back to how weeds and just plants in general are classified. Sometimes you'll also see the life cycle, or the time from when a seed germinates to the time it dies. These are very broad categories of how you can classify plants, but when you're trying to control a weed, sometimes this can be very important, useful information to know. So an annual plant, everybody's familiar with annuals because like wildflowers in many cases are annuals. It's a plant that generally completes its life cycle in under 1 year or one growing season. So it'll germinate, live its life, produce its flowers, and then die in less than a year. A biennial, and the name gives it away, is a plant that lives 2 years and then dies. So the first year will usually be mostly vegetative growth, and then the second year it will produce flowers, seed, and then die. And I have a picture. So the first, the little burr plant is Burr Clover. That's an annual. The red flowered plant in the left corner, that is called cowpea, not spelled P-E-A. So not the other kind of pea. That is a biennial. And then a perennial is everything that lives more than 2 years. A perennial can be a short-lived perennial, so live for a few years and then die, or it can be a very, very long-lived perennial, like an albizia tree. All three of these are in the legume family, in the Fabaceae. So just an example, like every family can have examples of all these life forms in them. And again, if you're dealing with weeds, knowing what kind of life cycle it has may be important in helping you to determine how to control it. How weeds are classified. Morphology, or basically the general shape, form of a plant, is another way plants and weeds are classified. And one of the broadest groupings of plants that we'll get, especially when we're looking at flowering plants, is monocots versus dicots. Cot is a short for cotyledon, or the first pair of leaves that will appear when a seed germinates. So in the broadest grouping of the word, a monocot produces one cotyledon, a dicot produces two. Monocots are, there are some other traits that distinguish monocots from dicots. Here's just a few examples of them. Monocots usually have parallel venation, flower parts in threes, stuff about the pollen and vascular bundles that's not ever going to be useful to you unless you're a professional botanist, but grasses, sedges, rushes, palms, orchids are all monocots. Dicots, two cotyledons, those are flowering plants that we would generally, you'll sometimes hear those described as broadleaves. So they have their two cotyledons, they have flower parts in 4s or 5s, and generally will have net-like leaves. You know, that's very, very generalized. That's not, you're gonna find all kinds of exceptions to that rule. But generally, those are two of the broadest groupings of flowering plants. And this does not include gymnosperms like pines, conifers, things. That's a completely different category. That's another morphological category. But knowing if something is a monocot or dicot is important if you're controlling weeds, because especially if you use herbicides, some things can be monocot specific, meaning that you can spray them on a grass and they won't kill the broadleaves, or some things that target broadleaf plants or dicots, but are generally not used on monocots. So spend a whole semester learning about the differences in these types of plants, but just to make you aware that that's another way plants can be grouped. Plants can also, and weeds can be divided by the types of habitats they grow in. So the broadest groupings of those are terrestrial, whether a plant grows on land or aquatic. And then there could be all kinds of subsets of terrestrial plants, plants that grow in forests, plants that grow in pastures, plants that grow in coastal habitats, plants that grow in upper elevations. Terrestrial has most of the types of plants that you're going to be dealing with if you're dealing with weeds, or if you're a grower or in horticulture. Aquatic plants, we don't have a lot of examples of aquatic plants, but we do have some very terrible weeds that are aquatic plants, including this one that Salvinia Molesta is an aquarium plant that took over a artificial lake on the island of Oahu, Lake Wilson, completely filled up the entire lake surface so that not a single drop of water was showing. And it started to make the water very anoxic and caused decomposition that was really smelly. And, and because people lived around this lake, the state spent, I think, over $1 million to control it. So just one weedy aquatic plant in one artificial lake on the island of Oahu. So aquatic weeds can be quite aggressive, but for the most part, we don't have a lot of aquatic habitats in Hawaii. We have streams and things, but they can be flash flooding. They're not always perennial. So the kinds of aquatic plants that were established don't generally like our streams. Excuse me. Now, weeds can also be designated. It can be given regulatory designation. And I'm not going to talk about all the weed legislation that's been passed in the United States, but if you're dealing with weeds, you'll sometimes hear something referred to as a noxious weed. So that's not just because you're mad at it and you think it's a disgusting or smelly plant. Noxious weed actually has a legal designation at both the federal and at the state level. Hawaii has its own noxious weed list and its own noxious weed law. All 50 states in the United States have their own list of noxious weeds as well. So these are plants that are regulated. Usually they're not allowed to be legally imported or grown, or in some cases sold. The majority of them, though, tend to be crop weeds, so weeds that are designated to protect agriculture. And in Hawaii, we only have 95 species on the noxious weed list. It hasn't been updated since 1992. And the mainland federal noxious weed list is primarily weeds that occur in temperate climates. So don't really do much for Hawaii. As I mentioned earlier, there's about 13,000 non-native plants in Hawaii. New ones are arriving every day. So from the noxious weed standpoint, very, very few plants are legally prevented from being brought into the state. 350,000 plants, in the world, and about 200 are regulated. So, basically everything can come in under legal designation. So to address this problem without updating the noxious weed list, people in Australia came up with this idea called the weed risk assessment system, and that's the job that I currently do. It's a proactive tool used to identify plants that can pose risk of causing ecological or environmental problems. And the way the system that we use in Hawaii works, this is based on a system they developed in Australia. I go through a series of 49 questions about the biology, the ecology, the history of invasiveness of plants elsewhere. The way I answer the questions gives them a numerical score that then generates a final score that places the plants in one of these broad risk categories. High risk, likely to cause problems; low risk, probably okay. And then this evaluate category in the middle, kind of a gray area. I I call the weed risk assessment non-regulatory because the results of these screenings of a plant are not legally binding. It's not because something is rated high risk doesn't mean it's illegal to grow it. It's more like an information label on a food product. So you can still legally purchase and grow most of the plants that are designated as high risk, but hopefully a weed risk assessment has provided you the information to know what you're growing or cultivating beforehand, so that if it is something that could be invasive or cause problems, you have that information. And maybe you can choose something that's like less invasive or low risk using the weed risk assessment results. So again, doesn't mean you have to. You can still eat spam if you want, but sometimes it may be better to choose a healthier option. The weed risk assessment system is not new. People have been studying weeds for a long time, and there was even this famous weed ecologist, Herbert Baker. You guys all know Herb. It's a good name for somebody studying plants, Herb, and studying weeds, Baker, but that's a completely different topic. He came up with this list of things that he considered traits that make an ideal weed, meaning something that can really spread, take over, establish on its own without human help. So that's loosely, roughly what weed risk assessments are based on, traits that could make a plant invasive or not. An example of a plant that is rated high risk is the Molucca raspberry, or Rubus sieboldii. It's naturalized, meaning that it has established and spreads on its own without human assistance. Currently on the islands of Hawaii and Kauai. It's actually also a Hawaii state noxious weed. Lots of Rubus species have escaped and spread and become problems where they're established. This one's got some other problems associated with it. It's prickly, spiny, like a lot of members in the genus Rubus. It's also got unpalatable foliage. So if it gets into a pasture and you're a rancher, you might not like this because it could take over and reduce your pasture productivity. It also can grow on, it's not limited by the kind of soil it'll grow on, so it'll basically be happy with all the different types of soils we have here. And it can spread by rhizomes, these runners that allow it to spread vegetatively and take over. Also spread by birds that like to eat the fruit and spread the seeds. So lots of traits that make this plant high risk and cause problems. Now on the other end of the scale, plants that are low risk, not likely to become invasive. Good example of a low risk non-native plant is Plumeria, Rubra, Frangipani, popular ornamental landscaping plant. Even low-risk plants can have some high-risk factors associated with them. Members in this family often have toxic or allergenic sap. Plumeria, this one in particular, is not very particular about the soil it'll grow on, so that's a good thing if you want to grow it. But if it's a weed, it means it could potentially spread to a lot of different habitats. But there are lots of risk-reducing factors that make this an ideal low-risk or non-native plant. It's not recognized as a pest anywhere in the world. It's been planted all over. It hasn't caused any problems. So it's got a very well-behaved plant, shade intolerant. So it's good for sunny locations. It's not going to escape and spread into one of our forests. It's never forming dense thickets anywhere that crowd out other vegetation. It has specialized pollinator requirements, and it doesn't spread vegetatively. So very, very well-behaved low-risk plant. You can find all the weed risk assessments that I've completed. There's over 2,000 of them now on this website called Plant Pono, and I'm going to return to this later with the link to the site, but I just wanted to mention it while I'm talking about weed risk assessments. There's a link to getting those weed risk assessments on this website. But now we've talked about what makes something a weed, some of the impacts about weeds, how they're classified. Now comes the the adult portion of the program, how plants, weeds reproduce. So if you are watching with kids, cover their eyes, make them leave the room. This is adult content. No, of course not. This is all plant, boring plant stuff, but how plants reproduce can tell us a lot about whether or not they might spread and possibly cause a problem. And just like there are broad categories of morphology, broad categories of life cycle, there are very broad categories of how plants reproduce. One way they can do that is by vegetative means or asexual means. Does not require any cross-pollination, fertilization, so a plant can spread on its own without having to reproduce with another plant or be cross-pollinated from another flower. And this is just a listing of, some of the many ways and parts of plants that allow them to spread vegetatively. Rhizomes are underground horizontal stems, stolons, above ground horizontal stems, tubers or nutlets, swollen ends of roots or rhizomes, bulbs, and roots, all allow plants to spread without the need of seeds. Returning to our toilet brush ginger or Himalayan ginger, this is a picture of the base of the plant. We use the ginger root. This is not the edible ginger that we use in cooking. This is an ornamental ginger. It's got that swollen rhizome or root mass, just like a lot of ginger species. This is a plant that can reproduce in several ways, including by bird dispersed seeds. But once it establishes in, say, a forest understory, it starts to expand from the base and grow and spread, like an ink blot or a coffee stain. Slowly and gradually, these rhizomes will spread so it can take over vegetatively. And if you try to, dig these up and you leave a piece of one of those rhizomes in the ground, it will resprout and grow. If you take a piece of that rhizome and you say, okay, I dug it out of my yard and I want to throw it in the gulch behind my property, that piece will sprout. When I used to work for Haleakala National Park, and this toilet brush or Himalayan ginger is invading one of our native rainforests there. So we would go in the forest and try to dig it out and prevent it from taking over. And we would spend a lot of time trying to dig up some of these rhizome or root masses, because we were in very remote locations where we could only access by helicopter. We couldn't carry these things out with us. So we wanted to leave them on site, try to get them to decompose. And we would put them in these very, very heavy duty, thick, super thick trash compact, the contractor bags, the super heavy duty ones. We put the rhizomes in there, tie them up and leave them on a trail to rot. And I swear we would come back sometimes a year later or 2 years later, we'd open up the bag and a piece of the rhizome would still be alive with a leaf coming out of it. In the thickest bag in the forest understory with no sunlight, no water, this thing was still alive. So plants are amazing. But vegetative spread is definitely one way plants can become quite weedy and problematic. And then sexual reproduction or cross-pollination or fertilization. I'm going to talk about very briefly how plants are pollinated or fertilized, seed and spore production, how these seeds or spores are dispersed, and then some of the traits that allow them to persist in an environment. So if plants are pollinated by a wide range of pollinators, they call that unspecialized pollination. So the more things that can pollinate a flower, the more likely it's going to produce seeds, and the more likely are that those seeds can spread and potentially cause problems. So in general, weedy plants are unspecialized in their pollinator requirements. So a plant like the Lucina leucocephala or Koahaule on the right there, it's got this little pom-pom shaped flower that can be visited by flies, by bees, by all kinds of pollinating insects. So it's not very particular about what pollinates it. And as a result, it's become quite a weedy roadside pasture weed in a lot of places on the island. Plants that have very specialized, highly specialized pollinator requirements, less likely to become weedy or invasive. Example in the upper left is Ficus Banyans or figs. You may have heard or know that each fig species is pollinated by one species of wasp. And only generally, there may be some exceptions to this, but generally one species of wasp will pollinate one species of ficus, and only one. So if you don't have the pollinator, that ficus will not produce viable seeds. So in Hawaii, if you see a banyan tree that's spreading and reproducing somewhere, that's because its pollinator was introduced either intentionally or accidentally. So if it's making seeds, it's because the pollinator arrived. If it's not making seeds, no pollinator. So ficus that don't have their pollinators are very well-behaved plants. Once they get their pollinator, some of them can become stranglers and get established in the canopy of another tree and start to wrap their roots around and kill the host tree that they're living on. Or they can get into rock walls and break apart the rock walls. Banyans are beautiful trees, but they can become very destructive in the wrong place, all dependent on whether or not their pollinator is here. Banyan pollination, ficus pollination is fascinating. So if you're interested in it, I definitely encourage you to Google it. It's amazing. And yeah, the whole flower structure and everything is incredible. Our native species, some of our native lobelias are also highly specialized pollination systems. Many of them have these beautiful inflorescences with curved flowers that are adapted for pollination by the curved bills of some of our native honey creepers. And when the honey creepers have started to decline, disappear, and in many cases go extinct, the native plants that are dependent on them for pollination don't produce viable seeds, or their seed set is much lower. So a lot of these plants are very rare and threatened or endangered in the wild. Never going to become a weed when they have that highly specialized of a pollinator requirement. Orchids are another great example of plants that have highly specialized pollinators for the most case. That's why we can have so many species of orchids introduced, cultivated, grown. Very few of them are ever escape or spread, and even fewer of those cause problems. If a plant can be pollinated by its own pollen, we call that self-compatibility. So if you have pollen from your male flower part pollinating the female flower part from the same plant, that's an advantage because you don't need another plant nearby to produce viable seeds. Turns out that a lot of weedy plants and invasive plants are self-compatible. They can be fertilized by pollen from their own flowers, and then they can take off. One plant can establish in the middle of nowhere, start to grow, reach maturity, become pollinated by its own flowers, and then spread from that one location. Myconia is a very weedy invasive rainforest tree that's self-compatible. And I threw this non-native cordidaria or pampas grass in there. This is actually an asexual form of reproduction that mimics sexual reproduction. It produces seeds through a process called apomixis, which is producing viable seeds without any cross pollination. And that's why this one species, Cordidaria jubata, has become highly invasive in California, in New Zealand, and in certain locations in Hawaii, particularly on the island of Maui. It's got these big feathery plumes that make it an attractive landscaping plant, but it doesn't stay put. Seeds can spread from this asexual or apomictic seed production. An example of a plant that is self-incompatible, meaning it cannot be pollinated by its own pollen, are native silver swords. If you've ever gone up to the summit of Haleakala and seen a silver sword in bloom, or maybe gone to one of the volcanoes on the Big Island where we have different species of silver sword, and you're fortunate enough to see one of these inflorescences, these 4 to 6 or sometimes 7 foot tall spikes of flowers, They're like one of the most spectacular flowering sites in the island. Each one of these flowering plants can produce hundreds of these tiny daisy-like, I call them flowers, but each one of those flowers is actually made up of hundreds of disc and ray florets. So one thing that looks like a daisy is actually multiple flowers. So anyway, one of these plants, if you know anything about silver swords, they flower once in their life and die. So they're putting all their energy into this big show of reproduction at the end, go out with a bang, hopefully produce seeds. Well, if you have only one silver sword flowering like this, with all these hundreds and hundreds of flowers on it, and there's no flowering silver sword nearby, 0 seeds will be produced. Silver swords are completely self-incompatible. They cannot be self-pollinated. They need 2 silver swords within flight distance of one of our native Hylaeus bees, a little yellow-faced bee, to transfer pollen from one to the other. So if a plant is self-incompatible, it's very unlikely to spread on its own unless there's a lot of it nearby, because it's not going to produce viable seeds. Seed and spore production is the result of pollination or fertilization. So plants that produce lots of seeds, lots of fertile seeds, or lots of fertile spores are going to increase their likelihood that they're going to establish and spread and possibly move beyond where we've planted them. A really great example of a plant that prolifically seeds, or in this case spores, is the Australian tree fern. Very popular landscaping fern native to Australia, as the name would imply. If you know anything about fern biology, though, they don't reproduce by flowers, they reproduce by spores, these wind-dispersed little grains that can be, carried far and wide on wind currents, and they can basically reach anywhere on the island where the wind will carry them. And because they can produce literally thousands and thousands of these things, they increase the odds that they're going to establish where they're not wanted. And Australian tree fern has escaped and spread into a lot of our native forests and is invading the understory. It's much faster growing than our native tree ferns, our hapuhu. So the more seeds you produce, the more likely you are to spread, and that's a trait of a lot of weeds. They can prolific seed producers. And then once you produce the seeds, how you get around is also an indicator of how likely you are to escape, spread, and possibly cause weedy problems. So here's just some broad categories of how seeds are moved around. One of the main ways seed moves around is by people. We intentionally plant them. So that's a category of dispersal. But natural dispersal can be all other different mechanisms. Plants have come up with all different kinds of ways to spread their seeds around. And all of them can be quite effective depending on where the plant is growing. Bird dispersed seeds can be spread around very effectively, especially if the fruit are small and can be eaten by birds that then will spread them and poop them out into the middle of the forest. Clydemia, or Custer's curse, is a plant produces the little blueberry-sized fruit that contain 500 to 800 pepper grain-sized seeds in each fruit. So a bird only has to eat one of those seeds, or one of those fruits, and it could be carrying about 800 seeds in its gut. And so one dropping will get a whole Clydemia invasion started somewhere where it wasn't wanted. Plants could also be spread by water. Mangroves are very effective at spreading along the coast. So beautiful plant, they're not native to Hawaii, and they can cause problems when they start to spread in areas where they're not wanted, like fish ponds on Molokai in particular are having problems with mangrove invasion. Wind dispersed seeds, another example. Those are blown up pictures of a African tulip seed. It looks like a little oatmeal flake surrounded by cellophane. That's actually its mechanism of dispersal. So people like African tulip trees. If they're driving along the Hana Highway, they always ask, what's that beautiful orange flower tree? If you're a farmer or a rancher or a taro farmer, you're always asking, how do I kill an African tulip? Because they're very quick growing, they're very aggressive, as beautiful as they are to look at, they can become highly invasive where they're not wanted. And then seeds can be dispersed externally. They have all kinds of different mechanisms to attach to fur, to shoelaces, to clothing. If you've ever gone anywhere hiking in Hawaii or farming or just walked anywhere where there's plants growing, chances are you've had to pick the seeds of this Spanish needle or Biden's pelosa out of your socks. So that's another very effective way. So weeds can have any one of these mechanisms to disperse, but the one common thing is that they're all pretty effective at moving around, however their seeds are dispersed. Where am I? Okay. So if you have a very large seed that's not easily dispersed, chances are you're not going to ever spread and establish and take over and cause problems. This is a picture of the largest seed on Earth, the nut of the Coco de Mer. It's a palm species native to islands in the Indian Ocean. And it is so large that it can, this is also a very endangered species. It's got male and female palm trees too. So not only does it produce these gigantic seeds that, you'd have to like check it in luggage if you were going to fly with it. It's so big. Nothing is going to move that. I pity the bird that tries to swallow that. And so the larger the seed, generally the fewer are produced by the plant. So not only is it unlikely to be accidentally spread around, plants put a lot of energy into producing seeds of that size, so there's not going to be many of them. So a plant like an avocado tree, not native to Hawaii, we've all seen avocado trees spreading on their own. They'll pop up where the seeds are discarded, but those are all usually based on the fact that, we planted them somewhere and then we discarded the seeds, or, maybe a pig moved the seeds around now that, they're established. But, avocado seeds aren't going to stick to your shoe. They're not going to be carried by a bird because they're so large. So they're limited in how they can get spread. So dispersal is an important trait to help you determine about, determine whether or not a plant is going to become weedy. And then once the seeds are produced and they get in the ground, how long they stick around can give you an indication of whether or not they're going to be weedy or invasive. Dormancy is an adaptation that prevents germination during unsuitable conditions that will lead to low seedling survival. So it's a way for a plant to hedge its bets. You don't want to just germinate during the first chance of the first drop of water, especially if that's the last rain you're going to get for a year. Seed bank is the natural storage of seeds. They can often be dormant in the soil. And so this is a strategy that has evolved in plants to allow them to ride out or to stick around until favorable conditions occur that allow them to grow. And you may have heard the saying, 1 year's seeds equals 7 years weeds. That's just a very concise way to say that seeds will generally persist in the soil long after the adult plant is gone. And some seeds can persist in the soil for years or decades, or I think I read that the longest lived seed was one that lasted for over 1,000 years. I think it was a lily. But in Hawaii, we have gorse that has been introduced and become invasive, particularly in upper elevation pastures on the Big Island in Maui. And the seeds of gorse can persist in the soil for at least 25 years. So you can get rid of all the gorse and the growing above ground, but you could be dealing with gorse seedlings popping up for decades after you've cleared the gorse. So long-lived seed banks are a good indication that a plant could become weedy and potentially invasive. Now that we know a little bit about what makes a weed, some of the impacts that weeds have, how plants reproduce and spread, all that information is what we use then to come up with a plan to manage the weed, whether it's something in your yard, something in your farm, or if you're working in conservation, something in a native ecosystem. So knowing what you're dealing with and how it reproduces and what kinds of impacts it causes, then helps you develop a strategy about how to deal with it. And the best method for managing weeds is prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth an ounce or a pound of cure. Weed ecologists, invasion biologists came up with this thing called the invasion curve. Don't have to like commit this to memory, but it's very, very simple, basic, and it's pretty intuitive once you think about it. When something is, before something gets here, that's the easiest time to deal with it. If you see a weed popping up in your yard for the first time, it's probably already gotten established. But say you see a seed that looks unfamiliar in your seed mix, and you pull that seed out, you prevented that problem from starting before it even had a chance to grow. As time passes and as more area is occupied, the costs of dealing with a weed or an invasive species goes up. So prevention is the best way. Keeping the weed or the invasive species out at the beginning is the best time to do it. If it's still a tiny population, you might be able to eradicate or eliminate your weed, but as it gets more and more established, you might switch to containment, where you're just trying to keep it in one area, spreading into other areas. And then eventually it becomes so widespread that you're dealing with what's called asset-based protection, where you're only protecting the things that are most valuable to you and letting everything else go. And you can see over there on the right, that's where the costs start to increase. So that's the most expensive time to deal with a problem, and it's also the least effective. So say you failed in your prevention and now you have to deal with the weeds. Well, there are many ways you can control them. These are very broad categories: cultural, mechanical, chemical, or biological. Cultural control is what you're going to usually do when you're in a yard or a garden or, you know, in a tinier landscape. It's creating conditions that favor your desirable or your wanted plants over your weeds. And so what are some ways you can do that? By water and fertilizing. Don't overdo it. A lot of weeds thrive with inputs of fertilizer or water. Your mowing height can also allow weeds to establish in the lawn. And if you're mowing too frequently, vegetable gardens, you might have heard this phrase, water, wait, cultivate. Sometimes before you plant your garden, you might want to like water and let things germinate, all the weedy plants that are in the soil, and then hoe them up or till them up. And then you could do that in multiple times before you're going to plant your vegetables or whatever it is you want to grow. And then for landscaping, spacing and density. If you want to shade out weeds, planting things in tightly can keep out, certain especially light-loving weeds. And this picture in the background is a picture of my weedy lawn being invaded by all kinds of broadleaf things. So I've done none of these things that I'm recommending to keep. Very, very, I am not I'm not a good lawn care person, so I will never get hired by a golf course. Other ways you can keep out weeds are by physically ripping them out or doing some kind of mechanical or physical thing to prevent them from establishing. So there are many ways you can do that. Organic mulches or synthetic mulches, solarization, mowing, tilling, hand hoeing, and pulling. So these are methods that, at least some of these methods, everybody is familiar with or used, especially if you have a garden. Organic mulches are just, what you think they are. They're just some kind of like natural product, usually a wood chip that can be spread on the ground. A thick barrier that prevents weed seeds from germinating, or if they do, makes them much easier to pull out because they have to grow through all that organic material to reach the surface. And in Hawaii, we are blessed with a very abundant supply of rock mulch, which can also be very attractive in the landscape and also suppress or keep weed problems down. These organic mulches can be used in combination with a synthetic mulch, which is just some kind of human-made barrier that is put down to keep the weed problem down. And I'm not going to go through all the different types of fabrics and porosity and different applications for synthetic mulches, but I just typed in synthetic mulch in Google and it said, one link came up with the 10 best weed barriers of 2021. So if you want to go online, you can find out what might be right for you. These are good, especially in places where you want to keep out almost all kinds of plants. So if you're doing like a walkway covered with gravel, a synthetic barrier that covered with rock makes weed maintenance a lot easier. And then, you know, every hardware or garden shop usually carries some kind of weed cloth or synthetic barrier. So you can just figure out what's right for your situation. Soil solarization is another method that some people use, especially if you're maybe an organic grower. You don't want to use any kind of pesticides. You can put down some kind of clear, usually a clear plastic sheet. It can sometimes be opaque. It's essentially a way to cook the soil and kill weed seeds, maybe some other pests and microbes that might be growing in the soil. The recommendations that are on there shouldn't be taken like literally for all situations. You might want to adapt to the conditions you're experiencing, but generally the point of this method is to maintain a high temperature in the top 6 inches of soil for an extended period of time so that you are frying or cooking all the undesirable things that are occurring in that soil. And then you go in afterwards and plant your desirable plant. We used to use this method to control some weeds in former pastures or grassy areas in Haleakala National Park when we were wanting to just kill everything that was growing there and then come in and plant some native plants. You obviously can't do this on a really huge scale, but if you want to do it in a smaller area, it can be a very effective non-chemical way to get some control. And then, you know, the tried and true methods, just pulling up plants by the roots, getting them below the soil surface, or rototilling are ways that people deal with weeds. So, you know, this is, you know, before rototillers, people used to, you know, get a plow and hook it up to an animal, and, you know, method that's worked since the dawn of agriculture is still being used today. And it's of course important to choose the right weapon for the job. So, you know, I'm not going to cover all those, but there are, you know, thousands of options to pick from. So if your physical method or your cultural methods aren't working, you can turn to something like a little more, you know, targeted. Chemical control is simply the use of herbicides to suppress, kill, or interrupt a weed's growth patterns. And you can spend a whole class, a whole course just on the different types of herbicides, different applications of herbicide, all the different chemicals that go into making herbicides. And there's obviously not enough time to do that in a short lecture. So I just wanted to emphasize some of these main points if you're going to be using herbicides for weed control. Doing it right includes picking the right herbicide for the job, applying it at the right rate, placing it on the right plants, not being willy-nilly where you're applying herbicides. The proper time of application is important because sunlight, rainfall could have some undesirable effects. How you're applying it, if it's granular, spray, using the proper protective equipment, those are all factors in using herbicides. But the most important one of all is to read and follow the herbicide label, because that is a legal document that herbicides are required to include when they're being sold. It has all kinds of information there on application rates, the type of protective equipment you need, what kinds of plants they can be applied on, what kinds of plants they're effective on, what plants you should absolutely not apply them on. Usually when you buy an herbicide at like a store, it'll be stuck right to the bottle. But you know, if you go to a website, they'll usually have some PDF that you can download the label to, especially if you lose it or it starts to degrade over time because you stored it in the shed and it got wet. And so labels are an important thing to follow, and always, if you don't follow the label and you do something that is against the label specifications, you could technically be legally liable for that. So it's not just a recommendation, it is actually a legal document. And of course, wearing the proper protective equipment is another important thing. So quick quiz, who is not wearing the proper PPE? And this is actually taken from a presentation called why women live longer than men. So that was very appropriate for chemical or herbicide use. Last but not least, biological control. This is a deliberate introduction of a natural predator, parasite, or pathogen to reduce the abundance of a pest. In this case, a weed pest, but there are biological control agents for insect pests as well. They may or may not be host specific. So in a lot of garden or agricultural settings, you'll get biological control agents like ladybird beetles released. They actually have breeding programs where they'll release, breed them up into certain numbers and then release them to an area because they are very effective, voracious predators of a lot of plant pests like aphids and scales. They're not host specific in that they're not particular about the species of aphid that they're going to eat. So this is a type of biological control that's commonly used, especially on the mainland. Not host specific, it's not being tested to see which target species it's going to consume. But for plants, when plants are weedy or invasive, we try to be very host specific so that there's very little, if zero chance that a non-target or the plant you don't want affected to be impacted by the biological control agent. Great example of very effective host-specific biological control was a caterpillar used to control prickly pear invasion in Australia and Hawaii, where hundreds of thousands of acres were dominated by Opuntia cactus, basically taking over huge areas. You couldn't move through them at all. And this is one of the classic examples of very effective biological control, where they went to the native range of this cactus, found a moth whose caterpillars fed on the cactus and didn't eliminate it, but it reduced its numbers so much that it's not really regarded as a problem anymore, either in Australia or Hawaii. You can still find prickly pear, but they're not like this anymore. And I just love the name of the biological control agent, so I had to share it. Cactoblastis cactorum. That is just like, come up with a name for a biological control agent. Cactoblastis, that's a good choice. In Hawaii, the US Forest Service conducts a lot of biological control research on this island for a lot of our pests, our weed pests of our native ecosystems. And they do very, very rigorous testing, years of testing to find an insect or a pathogen that will only attack the target weed and nothing else. So they tested on the host plant, in this case, Myconia, and they also tested on economically important crop plants, important native species, important landscaping ornamental species to see if any of these things can survive on something other than the Myconia. So only after years and years of doing these testing in quarantine will they consider releasing one of these biological control agents. So it's really controlled, very scientific. Hawaii Department of Agriculture also does tests on biological control agents, primarily of agricultural pests. So this is a very rigorous system. And you cannot talk about biocontrol without bringing up the mongoose. If you ever mention biological control and nobody's ever heard about biological control, they'll always still bring up the story of the mongoose. It's like, doesn't biological control mean the mongoose is going to kill all our birds? This is not biological control the way it's practiced today. Calling the mongoose release biological control is like comparing like bloodletting or leeches to modern medicine. So it couldn't be any further different from each other. The mongoose was not released by scientists. It wasn't tested on non-target species. It was released in the 1800s by sugarcane growers to control rats. Did they know or care if birds were going to be impacted? Maybe, maybe not. But anybody that knows anything about animals knows that this thing wasn't going to stick to one and only one species. So this is not a good example of how biocontrol goes wrong. This is just the case of somebody in a different era releasing something because they had one problem to solve and they didn't consider any of the other consequences. So another example, in the weed spectrum or in the weed category, if you were going to compare something to a mongoose, you might say, okay, I got this weed in my yard and I want to control it. So I'm going to let goats go in my yard to control the weed. What do you think would happen? Because goats are not very particular about what they like to eat. they're probably going to spread in areas where you don't want them. So you can't say that's a case of poor biological control. You can say that's a poor case of somebody not thinking through what they were doing. So biocontrol is a very effective way to control weeds, but it takes time, takes money, and it's not a quick solution. It takes years and years of effort before they can be used. So now that we know some ways to control weeds, I'm going to go through these quickly. Some useful resources, how you can learn more about weeds, invasive plants in general. There's tons of resources out there. The CTAR program in Hawaii, the Master Gardeners host program, has a very excellent like one source stop for all things weed, invasive plant related. There's all kinds of weed links on there about invasive plants, about weed identification, about pesticide information, about organic weed control. So this is a really useful website. The link is down there at the bottom, but if you just type CTAR weed control, you'll probably come across this. There's also great websites out there that you can access on your smartphone, tablet, or computer that allow you to do weed ID. This is a really popular one produced by a married couple, Forrest and Kim Starr, on the island of Maui. They've worked as biologists throughout the state, and during their travels, they've taken literally thousands of pictures of all the native and non-native plants that they've come across. They've posted them on this website, and a lot of the plant pictures I've used today are taken from their website because they say, just give us credit for the photos, but you can use them any way you want. So really excellent website. But it helps to know what if you want to just scroll through this and look at pictures, you can, come across plants like, oh, that's what that is. But this is, maybe more valuable if you already know what you're looking for. If you don't know the identification of your weed or your plant, there's another site that also produced by Forrest and Kim Starr. It's this Hawaii Plant ID. It's through the Flickr program, which is a photo hosting web-based program. It's free to join, but you do have to have a Flickr account. But on this website, you can upload pictures of the weeds or the plants you've seen on your hike, or the thing that's growing in the pot that you brought home from Home Depot and you didn't grow that plant. And you can send it to this website, and it's made up of both professional and amateur botanists, plant enthusiasts, taxonomists. And so it's like crowdsourced weed identification. And a lot of them are kind of like friendly, competitive with each other. So depending on how good your picture is, sometimes you can get a weed identification or a plant identification within a matter of minutes, hours, or sometimes days. But the key thing is you got to have good identifying features. So flowers and fruits are the best. How the leaves are arranged on the plant are important. If you can get an overall shot of the plant, that helps. Just a blurry corner of one edge of a leaf out of focus is not gonna lead to much. But this is a great resource, and it's a really great way to learn plants too. And just because it's a common plant that everybody knows what that is, the people on this website are very friendly. So even identify things that are common, maybe you just didn't know what it is. So great site to link to. Useful books. So if the power goes out, or civilization collapses and the internet goes down, there are, or if you're like me, you just like to hold something physical in your hand, there's still a lot of useful books out there. One which, unless you're a hardcore botany nerd or real plant geek, probably wouldn't recommend this one to start with, but this is what people call the Plant Bible in Hawaii. It's a 2-volume set, almost 2,000 pages. So it's about the size of the Bible. It's full of really, really detailed botanical descriptions of all the native and non-native plants established in Hawaii as of 1999. So it's a little bit dated, but it's still an excellent reference. Doesn't have a lot of color pictures in it though. Some color plates in the beginning, otherwise botanical illustrations. So this isn't the book you're going to go to identify that weed in your yard, but it is a great resource to have on your shelf, especially if you want to impress your botany friends. A little bit pricey though, so $110 I think was the last.
We got a copy here.
You got a copy?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good, and it is available in some you know, libraries and everything, and I'm not sure. Where am I here? Okay, the next one, Handbook of Hawaiian Weeds. This one is out of print, and so on Amazon's website, it was being sold for $500. Do not spend $500 on this unless you have a very rich relative. But this is like the Manual of Flowering Plants, that it doesn't have color pictures, it has black and white illustrations, but it's got much more like readable botanical descriptions of a lot of the commonly occurring weeds that you might come across in pastures and landscapes and roadsides. It's an older book, but you should be able to find copies of it in the library or you know, maybe even in a used bookstore. This is another one. The late great Art Whistler was a renowned botanist in Hawaii in the Pacific who just died last year. But he produced a whole bunch of these really nice field guides full of color pictures. You know, soft copies so you can carry them in your backpack, or, you know, they're easy to transport. This one, Wayside Plants of the Islands, includes weeds of Hawaii as well as other Pacific islands. So not all of the plants in here are found in Hawaii, but it does have very, very readable descriptions, and also descriptions of how you can determine lookalikes from the weeds. So very useful resource, and it's affordable too. I think it's like $20 when last I checked. This is another one that, you know, like the Manual of Flowering Plants, probably not your first purchase. It's a little bit pricey. It's also not specifically focusing on weeds, a tropical garden flora, but it has a really detailed, but slightly more friendly botanical descriptions of most of the cultivated plants in Hawaii, as well as a lot of our native plants. It's got beautiful botanical illustrations in there, and it's got a lot of like just neat cultural information about the plants as well. It's pretty big, pretty hefty, so not going to fit in your pocket. This is a reference to come back to when you get back home, but it's a really, really excellent reference. If you're working in plants in Hawaii, this is a must-have. And last but not least, this is another book that's pretty useful, Weeds of Hawaii's Pastures and Natural Areas. It's a soft cover book. It's out of print. No, actually, it's not out of print. You can download all the pages from this book off the CTAR website as PDFs. So you don't have to buy it, but if you'd like a soft copy, you can get it. I went to the Amazon website just to see if it was available, and they had a used copy for over $1,000. I was like, what kind? Unless you're really, that stimulus check is burning a hole in your pocket, do not spend $1,000 for this book. You can get it for much cheaper on the UH Press website, or you can get it for free as a PDF. So, but it is a really useful reference, especially if you're dealing with like more, you know, agricultural settings or pastures. So, but just don't forget to go outside. Don't just keep your eyes in the book like I am all the time. So what else can you do? I will pause here for the groan, because there's nothing worse than a botanical pun. But because you're master gardeners, you're all already above and beyond like what most people do to learn about plants and weeds. But you could essentially educate yourself and make informed planting choices. If you can, you know, choose non-invasive, non-native plants or native plants, and avoid those plants that are going to become weeds or cause problems in your own landscaping or in your neighbor's property or in the native forest. And one way you can find out about that is by this Plant Pono website that I mentioned earlier in the talk. It's one that posts all of the weed risk assessments I mentioned earlier, but it also contains a lot of useful information about growing native and non-native plants in particular types of environments they're suited for. And that Molly back there? Molly Murphy is a Big Island invasive species plant pono specialist. She is one of the big people, one of the main people that keeps this site maintained, updated, and full of very useful information. So this is a good place to find out more about what kinds of plants you might want to grow in your area. Learning about invasive weeds in your area, that's essentially what I just said. So, you know, it might help to know what's weedy, what's invasive, especially if you're intentionally cultivating it. You might want to choose something else if you can. This was fountain grass being sold at a nursery when, you know, you could have just gone outside and pulled it out of the ground and one of the thousands and thousands of it. No, what I'm saying is don't grow fountain grass. It's important to know. Each island has an invasive species committee that is full of very, very talented, knowledgeable people that are tasked with preventing the spread of some of our worst plant and animal or insect invaders on each island. Mostly deal with pests of the native ecosystems, but there's a lot of like human and agricultural pests as well. So you can, depending on, I didn't include Monisc or the Molokai invasive species committee on here. I ran out of room, but they also have their own website. And you can learn about what kinds of plants, what kinds of animals are being targeted on your particular island. And although they don't come and deal with the weeds in your yard, they are full of lots of people with lots of expertise that might be able to give you recommendations on how to control a weed or a problem plant in your area. So if you type in MISC, BISC, OISC, or KISC, it'll take you to one of their websites. They also give a lot of educational and outreach type talks as well. So encourage you to visit their sites. Or, you know, you could just Google anything, right? That's, we live in the internet age, so you type in a plant name, an invasive, naturalized, weedy, and you can come up with like more information than you'll ever be able to digest in one lifetime. And I think I am just about done. So I came across this quote the other day in a poem by Robert Frost that seemed applicable to this cartoon. Good plant or good fences make good neighbors. It's from Mending Wall by Robert Frost. So slightly wanted to modify that. I'm not a poet, but I thought that the corollary of that is that bad weeds make bad neighbors. So if you can keep the weeds under your control on your own property, maybe don't plant something that is going to cause problems for your neighbors. You know, you'll get along much better with everybody in your area, and you'll be helping out all the conservation and agriculture organizations that are dealing with invasive species in the islands. And you know, as much as we like to say all these invasive species give us job security, we have more job security than we'll ever be able to deal with in several lifetimes. So we don't need any more. And with that, I say thank you. And I think I'm done. And so thanks for your attention. And my contact information is there. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.
Thanks, Chuck. So do we have any questions?
Question on this side. So we got first of all, thank you for an amazing presentation.
Yeah.
Someone was asking, are imported plants required to be labeled for risk assessment?
I didn't catch what type of plants?
Are plants that are imported into the state or traveling inter-island, are they required to be labeled for risk assessment?
No, they are not required to be labeled for risk assessment. So there are a couple of cases where the State Department of Land and Natural Resources, DOFA, the Division of Forestry and Wildlife, if they're permitting or leasing state land, they might require weed risk assessments on the plants that are being proposed for growing on a particular parcel of land. But again, the weed risk assessments, those risk ratings are completely non-regulatory. So anything can still be brought in without a weed risk assessment, but finding out what risk a plant has before it's brought in, that's the ideal way to do it. But you know, right now there are all kinds of like national and international regulations dealing with trade that prevent us from, restricting trade on a lot of products. So things can be brought in even if they might pose a risk of invasiveness.
Yeah, and I think the emphasis here for master gardeners is that we kind of have the ear of homeowners. So if you can recommend looking at the weed risk assessment and recommending plants that are low in the weed risk assessment scale is important, because we don't want to be recommending plants that are necessarily going to be bad invasives, like fountain grass or something
Right.
like that.
And again, just because a plant is rated high risk or invasive doesn't mean you can never grow it. But you might, especially if it's already widely established on your island, you go, okay, I'm not going to contribute to a problem that doesn't already exist. But if it's something new, you might want to consider something else, a better option, just because you could be opening a can of worms that, it's difficult to contain once it gets out of, gets out of the box.
How's that, James?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we got a question over here.
Yeah, you didn't say anything about, I see people doing this, burning the weeds.
So we had a question about burning weeds for those of you online.
I didn't say anything about burning weeds. I guess that would kind of fall under the category of more like on the physical, mechanical control side of things. And I didn't bring that up because, for the most part, like a homeowner is probably not going to use that method. I mean, it's obviously comes with some risks. But yeah, fire is a and I know you mean like a weed torch, something too. Yeah, people are definitely it's a really effective way to control certain weeds. So absolutely, fire is a tool just like any other tool.
What you don't want to try it on is stuff with underground storage units. So anything with rhizomes, anything underground where you're not going to burn it because you're just going to have it grow right back up. Something like ginger is not as useful because first of all, it's a super fleshy plant that's going to take a lot to burn.
Yeah.
And it's going to regrow right away.
So what about like the sleeping grass?
Smaller annuals can, yes, even sleeping grass is something where if you're not getting it completely, because it does have some, to me, it's got a little bit of branching growth close to the ground. So even if you don't burn it fully. Now, I've never tried burning it to the ground and seeing if it comes back up. But some of it's going to be experimentation, some and some you don't. Like small annuals, guaranteed it's good. And then when you're getting up to plants that have more thicker root systems or underground storage units, where you're going to see problems, in my opinion. Sorry for taking that.
No, that's great. Yeah, I don't personally use like a weed torch, what they call them, very much. But it's not because I'm opposed to it. It's just I haven't had the need for one. But that's a good non-chemical way to control the weed. If the right kind of weed, though.
I like it too because if you're close to seeding, you can just kill the seeds instead of pulling it out and maybe dispersing the seeds when you're pulling.
No,
it out.
absolutely. Cook the seeds all in one. And for the sleeping grass, it's definitely. As long as there's not a lot of desirable plants growing around it too.
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Is there any other questions from the online community?
We're looking at two questions regarding steam. We got one that says there's a company recommending steam eradication. I actually may know that company. And then, has anyone been successful using steam for weed control? Are two questions.
I'm not familiar with anybody using steam to do weed control in Hawaii. The only superheating or kind of steam type methods I've heard used are for trying to sterilize posts that are being shipped inter-island for the rapid ohia death pathogen, trying to because there's a lot of ohia wood posts that used to get shipped inter-island for construction. And so some people are looking at that as a method to hopefully kill all the spores and infected or even wood that you don't know is infected. So just as like a treatment for sterilization. But as far as like weed control, that's an excellent question. I'm not familiar with it. And I have a lot of colleagues that work in weed management using all kinds of interesting methods. And there's one I didn't mention today because I didn't want to, it's easy to go off into a tangent, but there was a guy who moved to Florida. He was our weed ecologist for the state, Dr. James Leary. He developed a method of weed control using herbicides and paintball guns. It was like firing pellets of herbicide, the same type of device he used to play paintball, and they were using them from a helicopter. So, I mean, there's definitely very, very creative ways to control weeds, but if somebody would have used steam to control weeds, it would have been him, because he definitely comes up with like some very different ways. So I'm intrigued by that method, but I'm not familiar with it, and I don't know where it's been tried yet. But yeah, I would like to look that up, because that could be a good way to do it in a non-chemical way.
So I interacted with a company on Oahu that was promoting steaming for weed control. They actually moved on to steaming park benches and bus stops once COVID hit. But they were promoting that it would kill weeds. Of course, with steam control, what you're looking at is heating up the weeds themselves and then the soil enough to kill some living material. Specifically, in this case, it was nutsedge. We did a trial with the nutsedge, and it did kill the above ground growth back completely. But it immediately grew back. It was as if it had grazed it or if you mowed it. So the big problem there is yes, you can kill with steam. They do it with potting media when they're trying to sterilize media. That will kill off. But you have to get above a certain temperature for these weed species. And it was not successful in a home garden setting, at least for the steaming machinery that we were testing on Oahu. And that was specifically for nutsedge.
Yeah, I would think that steam would be more effective in like a controlled setting where more for sterilization purposes than weed control. But yeah, I would be interested to hear if there's any like successful applications of that anywhere. Because I mean, it could be just the more tools you have, it's like like a pocket knife. The more options. I mean, every weed is different, so not one method isn't always going to be effective for another. So the more options we have, the better. And yeah, I like the idea of steam. I just I haven't seen it successfully used in my experience.
Okay, so we have a question: will salt in the root system of a large Ficus elastica kill it in a lava rock wall? They're specifically looking for. I mean, there are considerations for using salt. But if it's not necessarily in your soil, if it's in a rock wall, could they use it?
That's another good question. I have not heard anybody using salt to control ficus. I mean, salt is a very, very effective plant killer. The problem with salt is obviously that once it's added to the environment, it doesn't break down. It might leach to areas where it's not wanted. So you have to be very careful about, where you're applying it. If it's in a salt heavy environment, like close to the coast where it's getting a lot of sea spray, maybe that won't matter. But if it's like near areas where you have desirable vegetation, you might want to be careful about like the transfer of that salt and water. Yeah, I couldn't say. I mean, it's another method that might work. Banyans are really, really difficult to control. And even if you're using herbicides, so you have a chemical to control it, it has to be applied in a particular way because, banyan trees have a very milky latex. And if you were to try to cut in them, they just bleed out this, it looks like Elmer's glue. And so it's to get like herbicide into the plant, you have to essentially like almost paint it on to the bark and let it absorb that way. And so there are particular herbicides that can do that.
but just like cutting and trying to treat it, even with salt would be possibly difficult because of the amount of like this milky sap that they push out. I would wonder if it could take enough in to kill the roots. You know, depending on how big it is, the roots could be very extensive. So you might get a little bit of control where you apply the salt, but to get it to transfer through the whole plant is an entirely different question. And that's
yeah, in this situation, I would say cut it back. If it's on a rock wall, maybe cut it back. And if you can get it to small enough where you can put a tarp over it and just cook it, especially if it's in a coastal area that's getting a lot of sun, just try to cook it, completely seal it and try to cook it, because I don't think the salt's going to work, especially on a rock wall. It's just going to wash away. We had another question about any comments on organic herbicides like acetic acid, clove oil, etc.
Yeah, organic herbicides are really good. Most of them, I should say like a lot of them are based on like contact spray. So it's like you spray it on something and then it'll physically burn the plant. So they're generally, you know, more of a contact killing application. And so that requires, you know, time for the herbicide to be absorbed by the plant and to stay on there long enough that it'll be effective. And again, you know, it just depends on the weed. Like if something has a lot of underground storage, a vast root system, you might be able to kill all of that surface material with an organic herbicide. But if it's not uptake, you know, it's not taken in by the plant and transferred to the roots, it could, you know, just resprout after all of that top material is killed. I'd say for like, you know, just like the weed torch, for annuals that, you know, don't live past a year, that could be like a very effective way to kill an annual weed. For more perennial type things, I just wonder about like the long-term effectiveness. Again, I'm not like trying to promote herbicides, like, you know, synthetic herbicides, but a lot of them are designed to be not just contact killers, but they call this term systemic, where the plant takes it up into its entire plant and then it gets transferred, you know, to the roots, to the stems, to the leaves. And so it is more effective at killing a plant. But yeah, an organic herbicide, if it's you get the right dose and it's the right type of plant, absolutely, I think it could be very effective.
Great.
We have a question, kind of a follow-up to that. Do you have suggestions for killing root systems organically? Maybe not systemic, but anything else, or something like preen or other organic option?
I don't really. I mean, most of the weed control that I've done throughout my career has been in natural areas, so in like national parks or in some kind of conservation district. And we definitely used synthetic herbicides a lot because, you know, where we were going was often a remote location and we didn't have, you know, the time to stay and see if something like that, you know, it was like controlling a weed in your yard where you can, you know, easily go back and control it. So we would usually go with something that we knew was going to work. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any suggestions for organic weed?
Yeah, just physical. I mean, basically, you just I don't know of any that are we're going to compare to something you could spray. I mean, what you're really looking for is just remove them and then use cultural management to outcompete with other plants is what I normally try to recommend for a long-term strategy, because I don't think any of the purported organic options that are supposed to be comparable to chemical pesticides are going to have the types of effects you're looking for, especially systemic. So for something a root system, pull it out and then get something in there so you're outcompeting plants that might reestablish.
So the cooking it wouldn't work then? Cutting it down and putting something?
Not in soil, no, it doesn't go deep enough. I mean, if this is like a woody root,
it's most likely below the soil surface to a point that something like trying to cover, like, okay, so in our garden, we cover our beds with a tarp or with weed mat to cook the soil surface. And that's just for annual plants that are coming up, just to prep the soil for replanting. That's not going to work for something that's got a woody root system because they're normally lower in the soil surface and they're not going to heat up as much, and they're more resilient than small annual weeds, small annual fibrous roots. So if it's a really woody root system, you got to kind of just dig it out. Or if it was me, I would use synthetic or dig. Yeah. Now, if it's something that's above ground, like that ficus that's on a rock wall, you could potentially do it. But I've never tried that because there might be enough heat exchange between that lava rock that even if you've got it really well sealed on the two sides where it's not sealed, you might have the heat escape to the point that you can't heat it up high enough. That's just
Basically, the cooking, it only works for about the top 6 inches.
If that.
Is in that.
If that. I don't even think the top 6 inches. No, top 2, top 3. Yeah. Like I after cooking, I don't like to cultivate because when you cultivate, you'll just bring up seeds from the bottom 6 inches, and those will most likely not be killed off. Yeah.
Sort of a follow-up to that as a suggestion. I haven't seen it done here, but on the mainland, I have seen folks introducing mushroom species, especially for things like stump removal. I saw there was a question about that as well. I know we're not allowed to import a lot of mushrooms because we don't want to make the problem worse in terms of invasive, especially after this great talk. But I know that there are ones that have been used for that in the mainland. So it might be worth looking around for that as well, for woody material, since a lot of the fungi will colonize those and then help break it down a little bit. It might not be full control though.
Sure.
Yeah.
We had one question about, and you can just go hog wild on this one with the synthetic stuff, stump killers. Anything to kill off a tree maybe that they've cut back that keeps regrowing.
Did they say what specific type of tree or just in general?
Just in general. But if you've got specifics, you can probably go on the most, like if you got Albizia or a ficus or maybe.
Yeah, I hesitate to recommend a specific herbicide when I don't know, what the tree it is that you're trying to control. But in general, there are, herbicide categories that are designed for, monocots or grass killers, and then there's broadleaf things. And then there are things that are, specifically designed for like woody brush control. And now if you go to a store like a Lowe's or a Home Depot or one of the big box stores, you're not going to get a lot of options as far as stuff to control like really persistent woody weeds that keep resprouting. You might need to go to something that's like more specialized, like, big, commercial, pesticide, herbicide store. And then that's where you'll find things that are sold not pre-mixed. You go to like Home Depot, it'll have like 8% of some active ingredient in it. And that might be good for the small weeds around your yard, but if it's a big, like aggressive tree, you might need a higher concentration. So there's a chemical in conservation, it's called triclopyr. And there are different commercial brands that carry triclopyr, but that has become kind of like a go-to weed killer for some of the bigger, woodier weeds. I know that they're doing some invasive banyan control in Kalopa State Park on Hawaii Island, where this introduced banyan tree, one of the ones that does have its pollinator and is producing seeds, these banyan trees are acting like strangler figs, and they're getting established in big ohia trees, and then they're growing around the ohia and killing them like a strangler. And because the adult part of the banyan tree is up in the canopy of the ohia, they don't have the ability to get up there and treat the actual tree, but they can treat these strangling roots that are encasing the ohia. And like I was mentioning, this is one that, because if you were to cut into one of the roots of this banyan, it would start bleeding this milky sap. But they've come up with a method where they've taken a paintbrush and a 100% concentration of this triclopyr, and it's painted onto the roots so that it's absorbed through the bark, and over time, you'll see the banyan in the ohia drop its leaves, and then eventually it'll start to decompose and break apart, and the ohia will be freed from that tree.
Do they scrape the roots, or do they
They don't
try to put
even,
it on just?
because it's 100%, the chemical, the mix of this one, it's almost like a diesel type carrier. So it just kind of is absorbed through the roots into the plant without any kind of.
Well, those aerial roots, they're already there to take up.
Right, and
water, so
but I mean, some of them, even on like
larger.
they start to form like a bark layer on them.
Okay.
So just in general, if you find an herbicide with the chemical triclopyr, which is TRICLOPYR, that has been an effective herbicide to control all kinds of woody invasive trees throughout the state. And depending on the method you're using, you either want to use a very high concentration in limited amounts, or a more dilute concentration, put in maybe broader amounts, just depending on, again, like I would recommend, don't look for like a simple answer here, but like do more research online and homework. And if you do have a question about a particular weedy tree, you can email me, or I do, also like I was mentioning earlier, these invasive species committees have a lot of expertise in controlling all kinds of weedy plants, different types, trees, shrubs, grasses, vines, and they might be able to come up with a particular recommendation for the plant you're trying to control. But definitely do more homework. Don't just take what I'm saying right here as the final answer.
Cool. All right, we got to wrap it up, folks, because we're about 30 minutes over. Well, I know we were supposed to go till 12, but we were only going till 11, and I want to give Molly some time over here in Hilo.
Okay. How are we doing, James, Kalani, Maui folks?
I think we're good on questions here. Really great talk. Thanks again.
Great, yeah.
Thank you all for your time, and best of luck with the remainder of the program. How far into it are you?
Gosh, we're almost 2/3.
2/3.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, coming up. Okay, so we're good. Are we gonna split off into our islands?
We are here.
Thank you, everyone.
All righty.
I will rematch.
Okay, well, we're logging off over in Hilo, yeah. Take care, everybody.
All right, well, nice